I wasn't planning on covering anything to do with the Ukrainian conflict or NATO or anything like that today, there was a comment article, sorry, an opinion piece that the Sydney Morning Herald carried that seemed the tone with how it was written didn't seem to match the normal SMH contributors, and the byline at the bottom showed that it was from the Telegraph. Okay, well that sort of explains then a bit more about why the article or why the opinion piece took the side that it did. And so I went and found the original back over in the Telegraph. So before we launch into this one, the Telegraph also then had an article more recent talking about the basically another set of air intercepts that took place, this time off the Alaskan coast, of 2 Tu-95 Bears and 2 Su-35s. Detected, remain in international airspace, so in essence, it's a non-event. They are outside territorial airspace. They're completely allowed to be there. Not an issue. Now, the US clearly maintains an air defence identification zone, an ADIZ, over that area, and therefore all aircraft that enter the ADIZ are expected to identify themselves, follow certain procedures, etc. But there is nothing legally that the US or anybody can do to basically exclude aircraft from transiting or being in the ADIZ unless they then penetrate territorial limits without permission. So this is a pretty routine thing, to be honest. Identified operating in the ADIZ, clear of US airspace. It is not the latest in a series of incursion threats. This is the Telegraph lying, really. It's not an incursion threat. It's routine operations. Now, this isn't defending Russian operations over anyone else. This is just plain and simple military operations, or even normal part of aviation. It's easy enough to go looking for examples elsewhere of every other nation doing the exact same thing. It's not an incursion threat. This is, unless they were flying directly at the territorial limit down to 13 miles before turning away hard and attempting to antagonize a response in that regard, in which case you might say, okay, that's a bit more of a threat. But if they're just beetling along in international airspace, fine. They're in the 80s. Cool. It's not an incursion threat. If you want to take rhetoric like this, then it would be fair for every other nation to say that if another nation is operating aircraft in international airspace, outside of territorial limits, that's an incursion threat. No, it's not. So, yeah, I mean, you can put up an E3, F-16s, etc. to identify, but an intercept in international airspace, you talk about antagonizing situations. The point of an ADIZ is identification. So once you've identified, leave them alone. Go away. That's it. Job done. And I mean, NORAD basically said it's the paper making the escalation. NORAD said nope, they remain in national airspace. avoided sovereign airspace, so stayed outside the territorial limits. And, well, okay, there are more aircraft in the Baltics, but again, we covered this last stream about how Russia has a narrow channel that they can get aircraft in and out of Kaliningrad back up to the St. Petersburg area, and it is completely legitimate in international airspace, and they are permitted to be there and operate in the manner that they do. The fact that they do it without, well, they don't have to submit flight plans to Estonia, that's for sure. They're in international airspace. There's no obligation to get permission from the nations they're flying past to tell them that they're there. Now, it might be good neighbourly, being a good neighbour, but there is no obligation, and guarantee Estonia and Finland and Norway and Denmark and Poland and everything else are not telling Russia when they're flying aircraft in that vicinity either. And there's Russian territorial seas there as well. And so it's like you're painting a picture of malfeasance for carrying out the exact same procedures that everybody else is actively doing all the time. And at some point that will get turned back on them, and that's not great. So we're going to skip. Okay. Yep. We talked again the other day about how politicians are not understanding it. It was discussed at length how the information that had been made public about the nature of the breach and everything else was that it appeared to be a nav error. It was not necessarily an intentional thing, and if you were going to be doing that intentionally, this is not the aircraft type you do it with, because it is not set up, it is not have the sensors or the avionics suites to do that with. So there's a complete path of logic that is being ignored for the sake of headlines. They're also conflating the drone sightings in Denmark and Sweden, I think it was Sweden, with the Russians, and saying that it's a hybrid attack and that we're going to get long-range weapons to attack the Russians. It's like, well, hang on, wait. They're punching rhetoric. The job of these articles is to make people upset and to make them want to go to war, push towards conflict for things that are permitted. They're permitted operations under international law. There's nothing, unless, well, even if they impact shipping, it's setting a bad precedent, as we've talked about before. So, yeah, the Russians have been a little bit grumpy. Again, there's no issues. I mean, they've been doing this long before 2022. In fact, if people get really upset about all this stuff, then maybe they should look into what the Open Skies Treaty was, and the fact that there used to be permitted overflights of both Russia by US aircraft and the US by Russian aircraft in order to ensure compliance with certain arms limitations treaties. But they got cancelled eventually. It's not unknown that has happened. And the fact that they entered the 80s, it'd be more of a concern if it said they were penetrating American airspace or Canadian airspace, but it's not. They can fly into the 80s no matter what. I could write an article like this pretty much most places where there's an aid is, pick a country that's nearby and build rhetoric to the same extent for exactly the same reasons. Now, I don't know about this about this event. I hadn't heard about it. I'm sure there'd be safety reporting out there somewhere. So that'd be worth chasing down at some point. So yeah, off Alaska. Going back then to the previous article that had then appeared in the Sydney Morning Herald as well. This is, well, it contains more details because they've gone to the airbase and got more details from the Italians and everything else. But you've got to look at how it puts the facts down and what it sprinkles between the facts and what that impact is going to have or what they're trying to push for. So, yep, two F-35s launched an intercept. Cool. Nothing odd here. If it was up to me, the person who wrote this would be sacked and not permitted back in the world of journalism ever again. The course of world affairs, for an instant, did not rest on the shoulders of 5 men. No. You're making the Himalayas out of a molehill. But anyway, routine aerial intercept. Yep. Wing side to side. They replied. The pilots waved back, waved the hand and waved, which would strongly suggest that the Russians were probably unaware that they'd penetrated the airspace at that point, and that they were doing rather routine stuff. And the fact that the aircraft trailed to Kaliningrad, which is, I mean, there's a diagram I've seen somewhere, but that doesn't match up with what the Estonians put up. And the getting into Kaliningrad from there is not necessarily flowing through Estonian airspace. So I don't know that it's unprecedented length of time. It's this time implying that there's going to be a time in the future they're going to shoot them down. It's going to be hostile. You know who's being hostile here? It's the NATO aircraft, which is which, if you listen to what the Russians have said, both in their statements at the Security Council and the various statements they've made to the Western media, they're like, well, no, we're just doing normal routine ops, which they are, and it's NATO running around threatening to shoot them down. And, I mean, NATO should be capitalised. But anyway. And NATO fighters were not forced to fire at the 3 MiG-31s. Under what circumstances? This person clearly lacks any sort of understanding of the airspace of rules and laws according to that. They're basically implying that the inadvertent penetration of national airspace deserves someone to be shot down when there's no active conflict between either of the nations or any of the nations right there. And this is really scary type stuff, that they're pushing this idea that when, where, and how they'll pull the trigger to shoot the Russians down. It's like, well, the Russians are going to be in the right when this happens. It will be a case of, okay, more than likely an inadvertent thing, even if it's intentional. It does not warrant such a response. This is rhetoric that seems more hostile than that of the Cold War. It's pushing things to an extent that it yeah, that make all the tension during the Cold War seem well, nothing. It's not great. Now, yeah, okay, fair enough. Great. The F-35s did their job, not a problem. NATO polices the airspace. Yep, not an issue. That's completely fine. So they've admitted that they're intercepting the Russians in international airspace, as in outside territorial limits. Right. Okay. So it's establishing the whole reason I'm talking about this establishing precedents. It's probably best given by the example at the end of World War II during the Nuremberg trials. They tried to declare unrestricted submarine warfare, or the way that submarine warfare was conducted, as a war crime, to even though it wasn't any of the conventions or anything like that at the time, in order to contribute to the case against the Germans on trial. However, the Americans and the British stepped in to say, no, we'll take that off the table, because it was going to impact how they conducted submarine operations and how they had been conducting submarine operations, because it would have set a precedent in international law and would have set a precedent in terms of war crimes that negatively impacted other nations who were seeking to basically do the same sort of thing with their submarine fleets, or actually do more with their submarine fleets. And this is a similar sort of thing. There's a push to carry out a series of events that before now were basically non-events. But to take it to the point of conflict, to take it to the point of engagement, is a very, very serious escalation. But one that you then hand to every other nation on Earth the ability to do so. And in some regards, this is kind of why the UN Security Council and the 5 nations with veto powers is meant to work, is that the idea being that one of the great powers, as they were, has the ability to veto the direction that other people are taking or trying to take things in a manner that, if the entire world has to commit to an agreement, if all the major powers who have very different ideologies and interests and everything else come to an agreement on that something should be done, great. That's the sort of thing that should take the world forward. But having the ability to veto things is a good balance against extreme action, be it extremes in any sort of way, shape, or form. But that seems to be sort of, again, falling by the wayside. So, okay. In the same sentence, they say that the Russian president was responsible for launching a spate of operations to probe NATO's ability to defend its borders, barrage of drones into Poland, airports in Oslo and Copenhagen had to close due to unattributed drones. Okay, you've opened this sentence by saying that the Russian president was responsible for this. In the last part of the sentence, oh no, they're unattributed. That's deceptive. Very, very deceptive. And ahead of this weekend's election in Moldova, Moscow is hinting at an invasion, apparently. Now, there's all sorts of things arguing about Russian influence in Moldova or not. Well, there's separate arguments for that. But if you look at the actual URL that pops up there at the bottom there, it's "Don't let Moldova fall to Russia. Zelensky warns United Nations." So what, is Moscow hinting at an invasion, or is Zelensky running his mouth? It looks like Zelensky's running his mouth. And no one's checking him on it. And that's allowing mistruths, half-truths, non-truths to be taken as the way forward, which doesn't help anybody at all. So, yep, they did the article for consultations, fair enough. What if the Jets do it again, and what if they tell them to push us harder? These are routine, if benign, things that take place. Seriously. So, yep, we looked at this. There were multiple articles from the last 5 years from Estonian media talking about the number of times that Russian aircraft had either inadvertently penetrated airspace or been intercepted passing through that narrow channel between down the middle of the Gulf of Finland. Generally around Vainloo Island, which again we talked about how small it was and talked about the nav errors that can create the issue that caused that. And okay, 5 miles into Estonian airspace. It's seriously an insignificant figure. Seriously an insignificant figure. If the jets had flown low-level supersonic over the middle of Tallinn, right, you might have more of an argument. But even with the images that Estonia put up, it was a glancing intercept. It was a glancing penetration of the airspace, which, for all money, it looks like a nav error. And I went through the processes that could have caused that, and what could have caused the penetration on the angle that it did. So the Russians basically did what people do in an intercept. Yep, perfectly fine. They behaved themselves. They didn't alter their course or steer out of Estonian airspace. Well, without being on radio. Again, I honestly believe, having seen the charts they've put up, looked at the actual territorial limits and looked at how navigation would be conducted in and around that area. Yeah, they would have believed they're already clear, and therefore it's making sudden moves, especially if you're doing transits. We talked about at length about archipelagic transits, straits transits, and things like that. You're not permitted to make massive moves through that, and it's not unknown for nations either side of a strait or archipelagic system to engage in threats or attempts to disrupt shipping and aircraft on freedom of navigation. And so, in this case, if the Russians believed that they were conducting operations in accordance with their freedom of navigation rights, then they weren't going to maneuver because they were following what they believed to be the procedures. The fact they were not in the correct position is a separate issue. But, yeah. So, yep, okay. This is a blatant lie. So the Russian fighter jet, well, it was a ground attack aircraft, not a fighter. That's the first error. Entered Turkish airspace in 2015. It was shot down within 17 seconds. Also a lie. There's two lies there. This was the aircraft, it was a ground attack aircraft working attacks against Turkmen rebels in the north of Syria. The rebels they were bombing were in Syrian territory. The aircraft was operating in Syrian territory. The Turkmen are a Turkic ethnic group, which Turkey really didn't like the idea of them being bombed or attacked in Syria. In terms of who had legal right to be in Syria at the time, the Russians were about the only international nation that had authority to be there. Obviously, the Syrians had authority to be there. It's their nation. The Russians were allied with Syria and were invited to be there. The Americans, Turks, and everybody else that went into Syria had no authority, no legal authority to be there. So we just conveniently look past that. Now, the Russian aircraft, because of its proximity to the Turkish border, had been warned repeatedly, apparently, by both Turkish and American air defense systems or airborne early warning systems that they were operating in the proximity of the Turkish border and they were to stay clear. Okay. Based on not only the footage of the shoot down that was made available, but also the information that was publicly released about aircraft track and location, and the actual physical location the event took place, it was clear that the Russian aircraft was in Syria and was maintaining its operations inside Syria. It was tracking parallel to the Turkish border, and so was not on an intercept path that would have penetrated Turkish airspace, carrying out ground attack operations in Syria. The shoot-down was an international incident and should have been an international incident. Problem is, Turkey seems to get away with a lot of things that they're not called to account for. But the shoot-down in that instance was essentially illegal. The Russians and Turks were not engaged in combat or in conflict, and even though they'd been warned, the Russians were clearly inside Syrian airspace. Now, they were on the order of a couple of miles from the border, but they were on the Syrian side of the border when they were engaged. They were tracking parallel to the Turkish border, so not on an intercept path. And when they were engaged, shot down, they crashed completely within Syrian territory and ejected and everything else. So the whole event was more than 17 seconds. It had been building for minutes to hours in terms of how long the aircraft had been on station doing its task, and the level of rhetoric and build-up from the Turks and the Americans and everybody else yelling and screaming at them to get out of the way. Well, legally the Russians were allowed to be there and had been invited to be there by the Syrians. So in this instance, he cited an illegal shoot down of a Russian aircraft. But because of the broader picture of what was going on in and around Syria at the time and who was there and who was engaged, yep, it got swept under the carpet. Guarantee, had the Russians been in Turkey or well inside Turkish airspace bombing Turkey itself, there would have been a lot more yelling and screaming about what went on. But even with the best aircraft systems and navigation procedures and things like that, errors happen when you're engaging in military operations. One example of that is blue on blue or blue on green attacks, which is when blue on blue is when one side engages its own side in attacks or its allies. Blue on green, can be seen as either attack on allied nations or attack on host nations. So in Afghanistan, for example, blue on green would have more likely have been US or coalition attack against Afghan National Army or government representative forces, whereas a blue on blue would be coalition and NATO attack against NATO forces, such as the number of times F-16s dropped bombs on coalition ground parties, for example. The Canadians were attacked by US aircraft, or during the Gulf War I in particular, there are a number of times when American ground forces were engaged by American aircraft because the target identification had broken down and the fog of war, the battle picture had basically dissolved, and it resulted in the deaths of American personnel at the hands of other American personnel. Now, there's a certain degree of attrition that sort of happens like that. I mean, during World War II, when the Americans launched a land invasion on the Aleutian in the Aleutian Islands, the Japanese had already withdrawn. So they were launching an invasion against unoccupied islands. Yet there were still a number of combat deaths or a number of deaths of American personnel within unopposed landings. Military operations and activities are not safe, and there are errors that happen. So it seems disingenuous to have an expectation that one side or one particular nation is expected to have completely perfect operations with no errors, and even the slightest deviation from a perceived standard that somebody else has set for them is enough to warrant them being shot down. So this whole some were asking why the blatant violation of NATO territory had not been met with the same response of shooting down the Russian aircraft from 2015. Okay, I just explained how that was an illegal shoot down, how that was not in Turkish airspace, it was in Syria. And so what? We're going to say we're going to shoot down, so the same response, you're going to shoot the Russians down in international airspace again, outside of territorial limits? That's the sort of rhetoric people are building up. And like I said, it sets a bad precedence. So, question whether the Russian pilots had strayed from their flight path by mistake. I went through in detail why that was more than likely the case. So, yeah, you've got hundreds of words building the flames of war, and then half a dozen words trying to ice things down again. So, yeah, they weren't. See here they admit they weren't heading towards the Estonian mainland, nor were they armed with missiles that could blow up targets on the ground. I went through that, and even the pictures in the intercept. Where is it? Not in that picture. There's another picture somewhere else of the intercept. No, it was on the other article. Showed clearly that they're carrying air-to-air missiles only. Now, the MiG-31 can carry, and as I talked about this the other day, can carry the Kinzhal cruise missile, and it also can carry an anti-radiation, so an anti-radar missile as well. And that's it. They're an air interceptor. They're a high-speed, high-altitude air interceptor. That's it. That's what they do. So, yeah, skip that. It is unclear under what circumstances a Russian fighter can be shot down? Well, they shouldn't be. I mean, I'm pretty sure there are clear rules of engagement that are contained in classified material inside NATO headquarters, but you're not going to tell random reporters that. Collective self-defense. To a degree. It comes down to hostile act, hostile intent. And so if you apply this principle to the shootdown, as this article has, of the Russian aircraft in Syria in 2015, the aircraft posed no threat to Turkey. It posed a threat to Turkish ethnic communities that were in Syria that the Turks supported. So it could be argued that actually it was Turkey actively engaging on behalf of the Turkmen. But a Russian jet has locked onto their aircraft. Okay, so you're talking about the use of things like fire control radars as opposed to air search radars, different modes. I mean, your electronic suites of countermeasures, not necessarily countermeasures, radar detectors, basically, will be able to tell radar type and what mode it's in. And so, yes, locking on doesn't necessarily mean anything. You can generate a track, have the tracker locked on an air search radar, basically building an air picture. Doesn't necessarily mean that you lock. I mean, it's not necessarily bad. Now, if it's a fire control radar, which implies generally that there's a weapon system associated with it, okay, it can be a little bit different. But there are plenty of occasions where fire control systems may be activated because generally they provide a lot more refined positioning data and parameters to follow. Doesn't necessarily mean an escalation. I mean, it's a slight escalation, but no one's given the argument why fire control radars would be used when the aircraft are transiting like that. No one's given an argument why. Yep, okay, fine. It's like saying, well, you can shoot someone down if they shoot you down. Well, yep, that's true. That's an absolute degree of self-defense. But you come down to rules of engagement. And the military lawyers and the various accords and agreements like Geneva agreements and things like that go into rather detail about under what circumstances unilateral action is permitted. So, yeah, it's not going to leave Estonia any more vulnerable or less than before. No, you guys are making things worse, to be honest. Russia is constantly trying to push boundaries. Well, possibly, but again, in this instance, I believe it was a benign error. So, I mean, you're not going to deploy military capability without it being capable of delivering lethal force. That's the whole point of militaries. And yes, if NATO issues specific threats, it has to back them up. But if it does back them up, Russia is going to smack it back down. And I don't believe that. It is not beyond Putin to send his pilots on a quasi-suicide mission to goad NATO into provocation. What drugs is this guy on? But anyway. But yeah, they're building air defense systems, etc. Not a problem. Yeah, nations can do that. That's not a problem. 5.4% of GDP is quite high. Um, this is, again, if Estonia bought their own aircraft, it would have the sovereign right to use its own planes to shoot down Russian jets, whatever NATO's views on the matter are. Without such aircraft, the decision to carry out air-to-air kills remains in NATO's hand. Well, again, it comes back to rules of engagement. And if they do this in international airspace, they've signed their own death warrant, really. I can see that if this happens, that Russians would take the gloves off. Basically, in Ukraine at the moment, they've withheld the use of a lot of their longer range strategic weaponry and have basically engaged with one hand tied behind their back for the conflict. And there is still capacity in reserve, and particularly the longer range, heavier stuff. That if NATO does this, it gives Russia the casus belli to respond not only in kind, but in force and with everything in its arsenal. And given the proximity of various nations and everything else, that's going to end very, very badly for a lot of people. Sadly, it'll be civilians and the everyday military person who will suffer the consequences more than anything else, whereas the people beating these drums for war and the politicians will generally avoid consequence. It's not a good thing that should be being pushed for on any side. The way this quote is put forward is ghoulish. Not girlish, ghoulish. The idea of barely any Russian troops in the regions of Leningrad and Pskov because they're stuck in Ukraine, he said with a smile. It's like, well, okay, we get the picture. We understand that you don't like them, but you're setting yourself up. And part of the whole good guy, bad guy in conflict is you're dehumanizing your opponent so that you can kill without feeling bad about it. And the fact might be simple enough to say there's few troops in and around Leningrad and Pskov because of other deployments elsewhere, or it could be because those regions are not seen as a threat, or the neighbouring nations aren't seen as a threat. You can say that without being ghoulish about it. So, or in Narva, the Russian propaganda bombards the local, largely ethnic Russian population. So in other words, they're people who speak Russian and have Russian ethnic ties, thanks to the deliberate extension of Moscow's radio and TV networks. So you've got a population that is more Russian than anything else that would want to listen to these networks and watch these TV networks and stuff. So you're saying that the NATO propaganda is failing because an ethnic Russian population doesn't want to listen to it? Or, yeah. And, yep, it's crisis is upsides for Talon. It's going to relax rules and regulations and, all sorts of things. Now, talk about it being a ghoulish article. They're deploying, more air defense missiles. It's the right thing in the right moment, said an Italian military official standing next to the missile launcher as gunfire echoed from a nearby Estonian firing range. Does that even need to be there? It's clearly saber rattling and building this image that, well, certainly isn't doing anything to de-escalate the situation. And this bit, the way they end the article is abhorrent, to say the least. Irrespective of what you may think of Russian or Russian people or Latvians or Estonians or Lithuanians or Poles or Finns or anybody really, I don't know how you justify finishing an article like this. And in the woods near Amari lies a warning to the Russian president, under graves marked with the tail wings of Soviet aircraft, so tail flashes, of Soviet aircraft. Several Russian pilots have been laid to rest. They fell during the 50 years when Russia occupied Estonia, during which time it built the base. Others yet may follow suit. That's not helpful. Quite clearly, not helpful. Really, really not helpful. Now, contrast that to when Putin and Trump had their meeting in Alaska at Elmendorf. That Putin visited the graves of Russian pilots who died during World War II and thanked the Americans for basically burying them with honours and continuing to respect and maintain their grave sites. Yeah, and before Putin went to Alaska, he visited a memorial in Russia that was basically the same but the other way. It wasn't actually, I don't think it had any Americans or allies buried with it, but it, in essence, was to commemorate that sort of stuff. Now, this is not presented in the same light or in the same manner. I can understand why Trump doesn't like the media sometimes. So that's the Telegraph version from the Sydney Morning Herald.